Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and for those who watch our show regularly, you'll know one of our favorite things to do is to dig deep into history and to talk about some periods that really don't get the kind of coverage that you might think. And our topic tonight is going to be World War I, the largest conflict of its time, but something largely ignored or disregarded in today's America. So our guest tonight is Jennifer Rude Klett, the author of the book Alamo Doughboy, about an actual doughboy who fought in World War I, and he happened to be your grandfather.
That's right.
So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you, Kevin.
Let's talk a little bit about how you came to this story in the first place, a little bit about your background and why, obviously it's your grandfather, but what prompted you to dig into this particular aspect of his life?
Well, I have a background in journalism and a journalism degree, a former newspaper reporter, and I knew that we were going to be experiencing some very significant anniversaries coming up pertaining to World War I. World War I was 1914 to 1918, and the United States entered the war in 1917. So next year we're going to be coming up on some very significant dates. And then, of course, in 1918 was when the war ended, and we had Armistice Day, which we now know as Veterans Day. And as a journalist, an incredible story fell into my lap, so to speak. I have a wonderful aunt who's 90 years old, and she saved everything and ended up giving me the war letters written by my grandfather, his uniform, his medals. Why she gave them to me, I don't know.
Because she knew deep down you're the one who would write about them.
Maybe she knew more than I knew. I never really had any desire to write a book. My background is in newspapers, but it was too good of a story to pass up.
So, as I read through it, the letters play a prominent role, of course, in the telling of the story. But there's a lot of research you had to do, and how hard was that? I mean, it's been nearly 100 years now. So how tough was it to find out this information?
Well, the research for me was the fun part, really digging and digging and digging, and it took me about 8 years. And the book is a true story. It's actually about 5 men from the Midwest, all from the same small town, and my grandfather is the main character in the book. And it was, I felt because they were family members, I kind of had the inside scoop and was privy to things that, you know, your normal book writer wouldn't have known. Like I said, I had the war letters written home. I ended up compiling, actually being very amazed at how everything I found corroborated everything else. The time, the place, everything just fell into place.
So your grandfather wasn't making things up in the letters he wrote home?
He had a good imagination, but no, he was not making things
that.
up. I ended up finding division histories, regiment histories, newspaper clippings, rare books, microfilm, some service records, although they can be very spotty due to there was a big fire at the National Personnel Record Center in 1973, so it's actually kind of difficult to get World War I records. So it was a lot of different sources that I pulled together, and it took me about 8 years to kind of get a story going.
Wow, that's dedication. You figured this is the story that needs to get out, right? So what comes across to me as I read it is the, well, first of all, you get a sense for just the quotidianness of the day-to-day life. It just was a slog, and it punctuated by horrible fighting. And you can kind of get that in the letters, where there's a lot of just sort of uncomfortable living in between fierce fighting.
Right, right. Yeah, the last 100 days of World War I was extremely tough. I know my grandfather went through a very trying time the last couple of weeks. Halloween night was probably his greatest time of peril for him. This was during the final battle of the war called the Moose Argonne, which was several weeks long, and ended on November 11th with the Armistice Day, everyone laying down their arms.
Now, you mentioned before our show that your grandfather's company was set to fight that last day, but they found out and decided not to. They found out about the armistice and decided not to.
You know, we've all heard about D-Day and what happened on D-Day in June of 1944.
In World War II.
In World War II. And it's interesting to note that in just the morning hours of November 11th in 1918, which was Armistice Day, so just in those morning hours, there were more casualties that fell than during D-Day.
That's astonishing. I mean, we think about D-Day as being one of the bloodiest of all days of any war, and yet the last day of World War I surpasses it.
That's fodder for historians, why we continued to fight in those early morning hours, because the armistice had been signed at about 7 a.m. Paris time. My grandfather was extremely lucky. He was with the Alamo Division, which is kind of where I got the title for the book. And his unit did receive word to cancel going over the top. He had gone over the top 4 times and was preparing himself again to go over the top for the 5th time, but then they were ordered to cancel the offensive.
And I think we should talk about that, excuse me, that concept of going over the top, that this was certain death for many soldiers, right? Because you would emerge from the safety of the trenches into usually withering fire from the opposing side. So this was a heart-pounding moment to every soldier, right? So what was now? His sense of relief must have been incredible.
Incredible. Yes, going over the top was. It started out in the trenches, and the commanding officer or person would blow a whistle. You'd literally climb out of the trench, and you would run into no man's land, which was the land in between the trenches. And you were a lot of times mowed down by German machine guns. In the last few weeks of the war, in the Meuse-Argonne, there was a lot of, there was not a lot of trench warfare. It was more open warfare, and the Germans were in concrete bunkers. But my grandfather still used that term, going over the top, because I think it was more than the physical act for him. It was preparing himself to go on the offensive, and he knew what it was like, and he was trying to strengthen himself and his resolve that he was going to go over the top once again. And
fortunately, did not have to.
Fortunately, it did not happen, correct.
Now, we were talking earlier about how much World War I changed the world and the United States in particular. But yet, despite that, and we'll get to some of those changes, but despite that, it seems to be unknown. I mean, we think of the greatest generation, the guys who fought World War II, and to take nothing away from what they did, the men who fought World War I faced, if anything, much fiercer conditions. And yet we don't really think much about that war, and it doesn't play a large part in our daily thinking.
Yes.
So why is that? What happened?
You know, I've struggled with the right term, and I think that the United States has come to kind of disregard our participation in World War I. And I'm not quite sure exactly why that is, but I think that may be a view that's shared by Europeans as well, that the American contribution has been somewhat underplayed. And I don't think that's entirely accurate.
Well, we entered the war late, right?
We did enter the war late. We entered and we fought, we participated for 19 months, as opposed to World War II, which was 4 years. But I think this even stretches back to in school, it's not stressed very much. I think the media has kind of downplayed World War I, and I'm hoping that that changes next year and the following year when we do experience some significant anniversaries with the Doughboys going over. Remember, there were 4.8 million people that fought from the United States in World War I. And it was mostly men. There were some women that fought, but 4.8 million people fought.
That's a large army by any
That's a large
any
army.
stretch.
The German Kaiser completely scoffed at us. Our army was very small prior to us entering World War I. He thought we were a bunch of cowboys.
Well,
And
largely we were at that time in history.
yes, there probably were a lot of cowboys. We were grossly underestimated. And I think just the fact that all these people mobilized in that short amount of time, and we sent 2 million over to France to fight, I think they were actually kind of blown away.
Well, I'm sure, yeah, because the United States, the population of the United States was not that large at that time, and we were largely still a rural economy.
Yes.
So the idea of raising an army of nearly 5 million soldiers must have seemed impossible.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was just astonishing what we did in that short amount of time.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that changed as a result of World War I. Certainly the map of Europe, the map of the Middle East.
Yeah, you know, you have to wonder what would the 20th century have looked like if there was not a World War I. World War I basically changed everything, and we have now emerged today as the sole world superpower. Keep in mind that we had never sent a large army overseas before. It was the very first time. We were very much of an isolationist country. And so this was a big change in foreign policy for the United States.
Well, I think what's interesting is that, and I'm sure you know this, that there was quite a bit of discussion about which side of the war we would enter, because there was a large contingent of German Americans, and there were many people here who felt that the German side was the correct side rather than the English and French side. So there was quite a bit of debate about, if we were going to enter the war, well, who should we support? And I think now, in retrospect, in history, we think, well, of course we were on this side, and that was obvious. But those things aren't always obvious at the time.
Well, we did have a very large immigrant population at that time. And especially in the Midwest, there were quite a few German Americans. But I think Great Britain was very instrumental in swaying public opinion, and the fact that the Germans were committing unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant ships, and then the sinking of the Lusitania. There's also something called the Zimmermann telegram that the Germans supposedly were in collusion with Mexico to get them to declare war on us. So once the war hit, I think there was a lot of actually anti-German sentiment. And if you were a German immigrant, you kind of hid it. You didn't really talk in German. So, I'm a nonfiction writer. My background's in journalism, and I did a story for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel last fall about how World War I changed our diet.
Changed what we ate?
Yes, it did, because I started out by talking about how people nowadays don't eat wheat and they don't eat meat. Well, that began in World War I. Victory Gardens began in World War I.
Now, I would think it's particularly wheat with the recognition of celiac disease, that's a very modern thing not to eat wheat, but you're saying that goes back 100 years.
It goes back 100 years. And even the anti-German sentiment spread to food. You didn't eat a Kaiser roll, you ate a hard roll. And you didn't eat sauerkraut, you ate Liberty cabbage.
Like Liberty fries in a recent American history.
That's correct.
Or freedom fries, excuse me, freedom fries.
Freedom fries, right,
yes.
Not French fries.
Right.
Exactly right.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't the food itself necessarily that changed, but the naming of the food, or did we actually change?
No, we actually did change our diet, and what we tried to do is we tried to send the superior food stuff over to help the doughboys fight. They needed fuel for fighting. So the so-called superior fats and grain and meat was sent over to help them fight. And it had preceded that, it had been sent over to help starving Europeans. And We all remember Herbert Hoover. He was nicknamed the Great Humanitarian because he headed up a food relief and literally saved millions of people from starving to death. This is before the United States entering the war.
In fact, I think that's one of those things that actually very few Americans know about Herbert Hoover. He's seen as being a failed president, but he was normally, as you say, he was seen as one of the world's great humanitarians.
Yes.
Prior to that,
Yes.
and was seen as a hugely successful person until his presidency and the
Yes.
Great Depression. So.
Right. Yeah. Something else to associate him with. Just a great. Didn't take any salary. Just oversaw this huge relief effort.
Because he felt it was the right thing to do.
Yes.
So think a little bit about politics as well. You mentioned before the show, in speculation, if World War I had not happened, what would have happened in Russia? Would there have been a Russian Revolution, for example?
Right. A lot of historians consider World War II just to be a continuation of the Great War. The World War I is also called the Great War. It's called the war to end all wars. Boy.
Which was not facetious or ironic at the time.
Right. The World War I was so horrible. To do it again seemed unimaginable at the time. But boy, yes, you're so right. Would there have been a Russian Revolution? Would communism have come to power? Would we, the United States, have fought in Korea and Vietnam? What would have happened to the countries in Europe and the Middle East? So much changed, but I think we as Americans really know very little about the Great War.
In fact, great empires were wiped out at the end of the war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist.
Yes,
and,
Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Also, I think something that's very significant in World War I was the fact that you saw the first modern-day genocide with the Armenians. And you saw a certain German soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler see that go unchecked.
Now that's an interesting thought. He would have seen that and said, well, there were no repercussions to that. So
I'm sure there's
okay.
been books just written on that, yeah. And you know, you were talking about how things that relate to the Great War are still happening. And governments today are still debating whether or not to call that a genocide.
The killing of the Armenians.
Yes.
Well, in fact, the modern country of Turkey fiercely opposes that.
Yes.
And there's repercussions that the Turks are willing to impart, economic repercussions for those countries that declared a genocide. Was it France that just, or the European Union?
I think it was Germany.
Germany?
I think Germany just did.
Just
yeah.
officially recognized it as a genocide.
Yes. Here we are 100 years later.
Yeah.
And it's still political.
It's a hot button. Yes, it's still very much a sore spot. And if we think about the boundaries in the Middle East, how we see all the countries, some particular countries disintegrating, well, those boundaries were largely drawn after World War I.
Yes.
Right, and they were
yes.
Kind of I won't say false, but they were a construction that had little to do with national identity or cultural heritage. They were arbitrary in a sense.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct.
So what, having written the book and having looked at it, what lessons do you think we as a country ought to learn at this point from World War I?
Boy, that is really a tough question.
I'm not trying to stump you.
Yeah, it kind of gets to the question of the nature of war and the nature of human beings. It was I knew my grandfather. He died when I was 16, and I loved him very much. It was very hard for me to reconcile him with my memories of being a gentle old man, a gentle grandfather, and then doing this research and reading his letters for the first time and realizing that he was a young man, a testosterone-filled young man that you know, had an eye for pretty girls and liked to trash talk the German Kaiser. And I often wondered, how did he just come home and act normal? That concept of transition between wartime and coming home, and how do you just slip back into civilian life? And I found that to be very fascinating because he never displayed any symptoms of, I'm going to use the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then it was called shell shock.
Right.
And I think a lot of it has to do with, in his case, that he was a Christian man. I think his faith gave him a foundation before he went over there. And then once he got back to deal with the concept of forgiveness, about forgiving himself for what he had done. He had killed people over there. That was not in his nature. And forgiving what other people had done to him.
Well, you talked earlier about the concept of moral injury.
Yes.
And is that kind of the difference between PTSD and moral injury being this concept of forgiveness, that it's not that I wake up with nightmares, but I know in my heart that I've done something I shouldn't have done, or that's not me.
Right. PTSD is considered to be more of a psychological disorder, and moral injury, it's also called soul injury, deals with injury on a spiritual level. And I did a very lengthy article in the newspaper, which is actually on my website, on the Jennifer in the Media page, and it really talks about what moral injury is and how new it is. It's just recently gotten a name. And I interviewed a Vietnam vet for it, and it just was a fascinating topic for me, is how you deal with that when you're brought up a certain way not to kill people, and then with a minimum amount of training, especially, you know, during the Great War, there was a draft, and a huge number of men went to war. These were not professional soldiers. And how they dealt with that, and they came back home. You mentioned the Greatest Generation. These were the men that put the food on the table during the Great Depression. These were the fathers of the so-called Greatest Generation. So not only did they also go off to war, but they had to be the breadwinner once they got home, deal with their war memories, and then they had to watch their sons go to fight the Germans all over again, which probably gave them a whole new perspective of what it's like in war.
I would think it would also have raised the question of the futility of war. Here they themselves had been through this horrendous experience, the war to end all wars, and then to see their children go off to fight in the same theater of operations, the same enemy, and think, well, what did we do that for? Why did we fight that first one, and now we're doing it again?
Right. It probably brought up a lot of bad memories. My grandfather never really talked about the war. Surprise, surprise, a lot of veterans don't like to.
Now, how do you know that your grandfather, you talked about him coming home and kind of slipping back into the normal rhythm of life. Do you know for a fact that that actually happened, or was there a rough transition?
If there was a rough transition, I don't think he let on. This again was the fact that I was able to interview family members, and I was extremely fortunate in that my Aunt Millie that I was alluding to, she formally interviewed her father, my grandfather, and recorded everything in the 1970s before he died. So I was able to come as close as I could to quote him about what had happened. And there were some things. He was a runner in the war, which meant he literally ran between units, or between his unit and headquarters during really key, intense times.
To relay messages, right?
To relay
this
messages.
Is the communication system.
And the life expectancy for a runner was about 7 to 10 days.
Wow.
And he had a couple of encounters during some of his runs that he never forgot. And the other thing that kind of haunted him, I know, was he encountered a his orders were if he found any Germans on his runs that he was to shoot to kill. Well,
while running, or did he get to stop? Did
well,
who knows?
Whatever got the job done.
Right.
But there was one particular time when he was on a run and he encountered a German soldier sitting on a stump. And the German put his hands up and he said, "Mother," and then he said, "Mercy." And my grandfather couldn't wait to see his own mother again. That kind of was what kept him going, although he probably would have never admitted it at the time.
Right.
And he couldn't shoot him. And so he just kept running. And my Aunt Millie said that my grandfather thought about that German soldier for the rest of his life.
And there's, of course, no way of knowing whether that German soldier survived the war, but one hopes he did. Right? And in fact, the war was filled with stories like that. There's one I'm sure you know. There's a famous story that I won't remember the details correctly about on Christmas in one of the years where the British and Germans met in no man's land to celebrate Christmas.
Yes, see, there are so many great stories about World War I. The other thing I wanted to mention, too, was that one of the cousins in the book, my grandfather's cousin, Carlton, was in the Lost Battalion. And the Lost Battalion was a group of units from the 77th Division who, in the final Muzargan Battle of the war, were completely isolated and cut off and just surrounded by Germans. And they were the most publicized thing in World War I, both within the American Expeditionary Forces and in the public media, until the war ended and Sergeant Elvin York came home, and then he ended up receiving a lot of the publicity, and so the Lost Battalion was quickly forgotten about.
They were lost again.
They were lost again, right. And they were never actually lost in the first place, nor were they a battalion, but that was a newspaper headline, so that's how they got their name.
So, but that battalion did actually survive that episode, right? When they were surrounded, they weren't captured by the Germans, for example.
Most of them died.
Most of them died.
Most of them died. Yes.
Yeah.
Very high casualty rate.
Now we have just about a minute left, but you want to talk a little bit about this poster that we have sitting here?
Yes, this is one of my my own posters from my World War I collection, and this is actually my favorite poster. The posters in World War I were very important because the new recruits, there was a literacy rate of about, I should say an illiteracy rate of about 31%. So you had to have a picture tell a story here. And this is one example of a propaganda poster about buying bonds to help finance the war. And during the time, this was actually considered very risque.
I can imagine. She's not clothed conservatively.
You can almost see through that.
Yes, almost. Well, on that note, with a little bit of risque graphics here, we're out of time already. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful. Thank you for explaining a little bit about that I didn't know about World War I. So we'll hope you'll come back with your next book, right?
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. Our guest has been Jennifer Rude Klett and her book, Alamo Doughboys. You can see us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19, and you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.